Let's do a quick overview of this respiration module. Um, it's kind of a look at the lungs there. So we just went over neuroanatomy and everything that we went over, all the neuroanatomical structures. That's where communication really begins, right? So we have to start with thought, decision making, thinking about what we're going to say, processing what people have said to us, coming up with new ideas, being creative. All that stuff happens in the frontal lobe here. And then after that, a lot of our speech processing is done in Broca's area, which of course is also in the frontal lobe, but not in the anterior frontal lobe. So that's also happening in the frontal lobe in Broca's area. And then we've got coordination of speech for the rest of the body. Once we already know what we're going to say when it comes out of us, that requires coordination with the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, breathing, which is, of course, going to include that pons medulla circuit, and then several cranial nerves also for movements of the face and also eye movements too. Um, both motor sensation and also um, sorry, not motor sensation, motor movement messages to come out to actually make the sound, and then also sensory messages to be able to correct flubs on the fly. So there's a feedback loop between the two. So that's all neuro. That's why we've started at neuro. But we're moving into the physical act of speaking now, and that all starts with respiration. So if you had 205 with me, you've heard me talk about the source filter model, which is what it's called in all the textbooks. I like to talk about it as the source filter model because really there's two sources. There's a power source, a sound source, and a filter. If you think about a stereo system or so, in your car, the power source is electricity. It's coming from the battery and it's powering the stereo. The sound source is the subwoofers that are in the back of your car, right? So they're like pushing on the air and they're making ripples through the air that we hear as music. And there's not really a filter in the case of your car, which is fine because this metaphor is more for respiration and the power source, not for the filter. I have a better metaphor when I get to the filter. Hopefully, we'll see if I do. In the human, the power source is respiration or breathing. So that's what's the electricity in your stereo is our breathing. The laryngeal buzz is the sound source. And then we have a filter on top of that, which is the pharynx, the oral cavity, and the nasal cavity. And that, molds the laryngeal buzz into something that is all of these different phonemes that you're hearing right now. Without the filter, it's just a buzz. So if you cut about right here on a person and just listen to what happened, it's just a buzzing sound that sounds pretty much like what's happening in this video. Now, I'm going to have a link to this so you can watch this on your own. Because actually, what's happening right now is I didn't route the sound from my computer into the video, so I can hear it, but you can't. But anyway, go to this and listen to it. It's just like a ma kind of sound. And then they're going to put this model of a vocal tract on top, and it goes from a nothing sound to an ah. Watch that. You may have seen it already in 205. It's one of my favorite videos, but it's mind blowing if you haven't seen it. Now, without the rest of that, without this vocal tract that we've got here, it's just this. It's just vocal folds opening and closing. And of course, this is fully adducted. It's fully open. That's not what it's going to look like when you're speaking. It's going to be more like this, and then this little opening, kind of like this, will just appear, and it's just little puffs of air. That's all it is. That's just what the buzz is little puffs of air coming out between um, the vocal folds. It's a lot like, yep, there we go. It's a lot like when you take a balloon, you blow a balloon up, and then you pull the top. You know, you don't really pinch it, you just pull it tight, and then it kind of goes wee like that. That's exactly what your vocal folds are doing. Little puffs of air coming out those, between the vocal folds or between the ends of the balloon. And that's a good model of what's actually happening with your vocal folds. So if you have a balloon, do that. Also, if you, so any brass players, brass instrument players, you'll know the old trick that you used to have to do into the mouthpiece to get your uh, instrument to function. That's the same thing. It's all being powered by air. So in the balloon, it's the air in the balloon coming out that's powering that sound, that little scream. When the balloon's out of air, the scream stops. When you're out of air, you can't anymore. So you have to breathe in again. People who are really good can continue that noise with just air in their mouth and breathe in while they're doing. That's called circular breathing, and it's hard to do. Um, but either way, it all comes from the flow of air. All of this sound comes from the flow of air, and it's no different for the larynx and the vocal folds. It all comes from the flow of air. And that's just for a constant sound. That's just for which is hardly ever what we're doing. All the speaking that we're doing also requires the muscles of respiration to work in concert with everything else. When I'm talking, air is flowing, and when I'm pausing, I'm not breathing at all. So there's really tight coordination between the effectors in the mouth and the muscles of respiration, which you're going to learn about in this module as well. Um, when you're speaking louder, it means more air is being forced out. That's also the muscles of expiration in this case, or exhalation, expiration, exhalation, either one. So you're pushing more air out. And if you have something really crazy to say and you get really low, you're also using the muscles of expiration, exhalation differently. You're letting less air come out. So you have less volume. So the way that you modulate your volume is you modulate the flow of air. And we'll talk about the way you modulate your pitch in the next module because that has nothing to do with airflow. But to kind of ground you where we're going and why we're talking about respiration is because it's the power source. It all comes from the little puffs of air at the vocal folds because of airflow. If a person has breathing problems, they're probably going to have speech problems. If they can't get enough air, they don't have good running speech. They'll have to take a few breaths, at odd points in the conversation. Um, if they don't have, if they can't ventilate on their own, they have to rely on mechanical ventilation. That also screws up the rhythms of speech. And the reason it does that is because this is a power source. It's the thing that starts everything flowing. Um, all right. The only time that that's not true is if somebody's had a laryngectomy. In that case, you don't have to have uh, vocal folds creating laryngeal buzz, which means you don't have to have breathing being the power source. You don't have to have respiration in the system. What you're using then is a little electrolarynx, which creates the buzz itself. So it's a little handheld thing and it creates a buzz, which then you can still use all of the other effectors, the pharynx, the oral cavity, the nasal cavity, to mold that in the same way that you would the buzz that comes from the larynx. In this case, the power source is electricity, again, just like back to the stereo. But for everyone who is speaking in a typical way, breathing is absolutely the power source and the thing that sets it all in motion. Okay, well that's it for the overview, and I'll see you in the other videos.